Very much. Mi chiamo Matteo Gaetano, ma non parlo italiano bene. Mi dispiace. But I'm very thankful to this seminar for giving this opportunity. My focus has generally been on Dominicans and Jesuits, so this is a little bit out of my normal focus. So it's a true essay, an attempt at something. So thank you. The Via Scotti, a current or tradition of theological and philosophical teaching following John Duns Scotus, continue to have a place at some European universities during the period that we refer to as the Renaissance, the 15th and 16th centuries. Indeed, chairs of Scotistic theology and metaphysics were instituted in the second half of the 15th century at Padua, and Franciscans thus taught alongside a professor of rhetoric connected with the Renaissance humanist tradition, as well as Dominican professors in Via Sancti Tome, and of course, the standard university subjects. These Scotists at Padua and elsewhere interacted with churchmen, political figures, lawyers, physicians, and natural philosophers of the era. The question that I seek to touch on today, however, is the extent to which we can speak about Renaissance Scotism as more than a current tradition or school that happened to exist during the Renaissance. Rather, the question here is Scotism's interaction with some of the trends that mark the intellectual life of this period. The humanist movement's focus on the Studia Humanitatis, especially Latin eloquence, the translation of all of the Platonic corpus into Latin, and Christian Hebraism, particularly the study of Jewish literature, claiming to have access to unwritten doctrines handed down at least since the days of Moses or Kabbalah. So I'm not saying these Scotists are humanists, but we want to see this interaction. Scotus subtlety and Ciceronian eloquence were then, as now, generally deemed to be at odds. Indeed, the major northern humanist, Desiderius Erasmus, seems to have had a particular contempt for John Duns Scotus and his followers. In praise of folly, Folly spoke of Scotus's spirit as far thornier than any porcupine or hedgehog, and indicated that Peter and the apostles would have had no idea what to make of Scotistic dissertations and definitions about issues connected with transubstantiation. In Erasmus's 1522, The Godly Feast, he presented the character Eusebius as saying that he always rose from the reading of Cicero and Plutarch inspired to live virtuously, an effect never produced by Scotus, who made him somehow less enthusiastic about true virtue, but more contentious. He said much the same in his own voice. In 1518, Erasmus wrote in his letter laying out the Philosophia Christi to Paul Voles that he was unmoved by the jeers of some men who attacked his Handbook of the Christian Soldier, because that work handles no Scotistic problems, as though nothing could show learning without them. And in his Ratio Vere Theologiae, Erasmus attacked Pierre Tartaret, a significant Scotist at the University of Paris at the time, as merely occupied with sophistical quibbling with hodgepodge sumile and collections, a figure for whom divine literature does not have its true taste, but only the taste he brings to it. These humanistic attacks on the subtle logic of the schoolmen and the abstruse elaboration of Christian theology are, of course, standard fare. What is perhaps still less well known is the fact that a correspondent and friend of Erasmus, John Fisher, who would be executed or martyred in the mid-1530s with Thomas More, though inspired by Erasmus and others to involve himself in academic reform at Cambridge, where there was a Scotistic current, defended not only the scholastics in general, but Scotus in particular. He did so while acknowledging and celebrating the fact that much had changed since the late 13th century. Lectures on the humanities, or Bone Literae, had been introduced at Cambridge in the 1480s and 1490s, and Fisher helped to encourage the study of Greek in the early 15 teens, and eventually supported the Trace Linguae. Fisher worked on Hebrew and studied the Kabbalistic text being produced by the Christian Hebraist and humanist Johann Reuchlin. Nonetheless, Fisher named Scotus in his 1516 statutes for St. John's College and said that Scotus's acumen recommends itself most strongly to me. Fisher would eventually draw on Scotus in dealing with the sacrament of penance and the authority of the church in his disputes with Luther. Indeed, the former Cambridge Augustinian and follower of Luther, Robert Barnes, who would also be executed by Henry VIII, attacked Fisher along with all his Duns men. In 1530, Fisher said that he wanted a lectureship on Hebrew, but if that could not be done, this hour could be occupied by a course on Scotus, so Hebrew or Scotus. Yet he then added that this lectureship must make an effort to turn him into better Latin. An academic reformer in the Erasmian circle like Fisher could still cherish the theological insights of the medieval Franciscan, but efforts must be made to conform to the eloquence demanded by the humanist movement. Scholars have pointed to Fisher as a useful case for avoiding the sharp dichotomies between humanism and scholasticism that characterized older scholarship. They have also indicated that his vision of unity was rooted in his admiration for Giovanni Pico della Mirandola as a bringer of concord. At least that was his reading of Pico. When writing to Erasmus about his enthusiasm for Reuchlin's recovery of arcane truths in Jewish literature, Fisher said that Reuchlin's scholarship delights me so hugely that in my reckoning, no man alive comes closer to Pico, who was already dead in 1494. Pico himself most famously confronted the issue of philosophical rigor and humanistic eloquence in his letter of June 1485 to Ermolao Barbaro. With more than a dash of sarcasm, Pico expressed shame in the 6 years, so many sleepless nights that he spent on barbarians like Aquinas, Scotus, Albert the Great, and Averroes, when he could have used them to become something in fine letters. Pico did not, like Fisher, call for Scotus to be turned into eloquent Latin, but said in the character of a slightly more eloquent barbarian championing his barbarism, that the scholastic should be judged according to the Parisian diction rather than Roman eloquence. Scotus, Pico says, might say things without taste, crudely, in non-Latin words, but he philosophized better than the materialist Lucretius, who wrote elegant poetry but who rejected divine providence and reduced all things to chance combinations of bits of matter. Scotus might not know the decrees of the grammarians or the poets, but he did know the decrees of God and of nature. About a century later, in the late 1500s, Antonio Riccoboni, a professor of humanistic subjects at the University of Padua, indicated that his Scotist colleagues were certainly not as dismissive of eloquence as the persona in Pico's exchange with Barbaro. He referred to Bonaventura Manenti, professor of Scotist theology in the 1560s through the 80s, as most studiously pursuing the arts which pertain to humanity, ad humanitatem, before becoming a professor. A man whose participation in the circles and gatherings of the university community won the admiration of all students. Manenti's successor as theologian in Via Scotti, Girolamo Palantieri, who we'll revisit in a moment, was described as a great orator. Carlo De Leo, a professor of Scotist metaphysics, likewise studied the humanities such as Latin and Greek literature, rhetoric, and poetry. Riccoboni described De Leo as deploying his eloquence and scholarly acumen in order to bring a singular light to, quote, his most obscure Dr. Scotus. So there's still that Erasmian concern. The humanist professor Riccoboni could distinguish the styles of Scotus and his 16th century disciples without dismissing the unity of this theological tradition. And in the longer paper, I'm hoping to do a little more work with Cornelio Musso, the great Franciscan preacher trained in this context. Much later in the 1630s, the Irish Franciscan Lucas Wadding did not simply refer to later teachers who could illuminate Scotus's obscurity and unravel some of his subtlety. Rather, he defended Scotus from the charge of obscurity by invoking the hero of the humanists, Cicero. In De Finibus 225, Cicero wrote the following: obscurity is excusable on two grounds. It may be deliberately adopted, as in the case of Heraclitus, the surname of the obscure who bore so dark his philosophic lore, or the obscurity may be due to the abstruseness of the subject and not of style. An instance of this, Cicero says, is Plato's Timaeus. Scotus, Wadding said, adapted his style and method to the most profound arcana, the secrets that he was examining. Though Wadding was arguably writing after our period, one can see this sort of approach within text from the Renaissance era. Back in the early 16th century, one sees this sort of justification for Scotus's style and attempts to produce tools to help students manage such difficulties. Kind of age of pedagogy here. One of the earliest professors of Scotus theology at Padua, Maurice O'Fihely, and a remarkably productive editor of Scotus's works, put a reference to Scotus as an eagle who builds his nest in lofty places. No one flew higher than Scotus in revealing the secrets of the divine nature. And he discussed in the front matter of other texts that he hoped that these materials would give students access, even just a taste, of Scotistic insights. This pairing of reverence for Scotus's profundity with pedagogical and other aids was a common refrain. This justification of Scotus's subtlety with reference to arcane mysteries also came in Antonio de Fantis' Tabula. This Franciscan student of the Paduan Antonio Trombetta, who we'll be hearing about in a future talk, sought to help other students avoid shipwreck as they navigated the abyss of Scotistic subtlety. Fontes knew that Cicero, Quintilian, and Pliny occupied scholars day and night because of their powers of Latinity and eloquence. But he thought that even greater effort should be expended by Christian students on divine subtlety. If you're going to work so hard to understand Quintilian's eloquence, why not Scotus? While Fontes was striking out here at humanistic studies, he nonetheless concluded his letter to the reader with Pliny the Younger, saying that the acquisition of certain things is too much to hope for. It can only be granted by the gods. The front matter of the commentary on Book 1 of the Sentences of Jacobino Malafossa da Barge, who taught metaphysics in Via Scotti for about 40 years at Padua, opened with two poems, noting Scotus's obscurity, which Malafossa's work helped to make more splendid, and the darkness of Scotus, which Malafossa put to flight. The ready availability of new works of Plato, so the kind of second theme, in Latin made a mark on Scotus in the early 16th century, but it does not appear to have been very substantial in the works of Scotus, at least in Padua. And I've seen something very different in a few of the Dominican professors of Thomism at the university who make use of the new materials, Girolamo Vielmi and others. O'Fihely's dedication to the Doge referred to texts unavailable to his master Scotus, the Gorgias, the Alcibiades. Malafossa referred to Plato's Critias and Phaedo. But in the body of the text, there is a remarkable absence, and I'm always worried about arguments from silence, but I think it's striking. Malafossa is taking up a line of argumentation where he asserts that Plato was the best metaphysician. He offered a rather lengthy discussion of the Platonic ideas, where he cited Francis of Meron from the early 1300s, who said that Aristotle was the best natural philosopher and the worst metaphysician. For Malafossa, Aristotle could not grasp that Plato put the ideas in the divine mind. This discussion made no reference, though, to the Platonic corpus available since Marsilio Ficino's translation published in 1484, decades earlier. It did not draw upon the so-called Neoplatonic materials that could have helped to clarify or elaborate these points. His references were to Augustine, Macrobius, and Boethius. In fact, after checking this out a bit more, he lifted almost this entire discussion from William of Borrolone, who had died, a Franciscan who had died in the 1460s before this resurgence of Platonic materials in the late 1400s. Much more detailed discussion of these relatively recently recovered sources could be found, though, in a Franciscan writer such as Francesco Zorzi, or Zorzi, who died in 1540. Zorzi not only made use of the Platonic sources, but also Hermetic and Kabbalistic texts. Indeed, a number of the major figures who developed the Christian discovery, even if in distorted form, of these Jewish materials, were Franciscans. Pietro Galatino, Arcangelo Borgonuovo. All of them seem to have had a broadly Scotistic formation in the Franciscan order. It's unlikely that any of them would fit any 16th or 21st century definitions of Scotism. Nonetheless, each of them expressed substantial admiration for Scotus in their rather esoteric works. This is noteworthy when contrasted with a Franciscan writer like Conrad Pelikan, a figure who pursued the sorts of studies initiated by Reuchlin and Erasmus, and then rejected his own rather extensive Scotistic formation and even the Roman Catholic Church. Pelikan was a student of the Scotist Paulus Scriptoris, as well as Reuchlin. He ended up, however, in Ulrich Zwingli's circle in Zurich. In his chronicle, which is quite fascinating work, Pelikan praised a superior of his for always abhorring Scotus and expressed disgust at a new minister general of the Franciscans who supposedly forbade the scriptures and ordered that only Scotus be read. So that's the other extreme, interested in his materials and rejecting his own order, the Catholic Church, Scotism, etc. In sharp contrast, Zorzi's On the Harmony of the World referred to Scotus as a man of the gravest judgment. He asserted that Scotus corresponded to Augustine as Albert the Great to Ambrose, Giles of Rome to Jerome, and Henry of Ghent to Origen. So that patristic interest of the Renaissance, some Renaissance humanists. The musical structure of the work, The Harmony of the World, organized according to tones, led Zorzi to say that Scotus's resonance with Augustine was a lofty sound, but one that was grave and which had a more deliberate motion. Zorzi linked Scotus with the 5th century Neoplatonist Proclus to explain the way in which what emanates from the one can be both one and many. In discussing the long-standing problem of Aristotle's view of the eternity of the world, Zorzi turned to Scotus's gravity and judiciousness to articulate that Aristotle did nothing but show that there could be no time at all without the world's existence. The close connection of citations of the Church Fathers, Plato and the Neoplatonists, and Scotus help us to see a different path than what we saw in Malaphosa, very little new material, as well as what one finds in Pelikan, a rejection of Scotism. Zorzi's controversial problems of the sacred scripture, Problemata, once again put Scotus into dialogue with these new materials. Alongside standard scholastic debates about Scotus's emphasis on the will and love, Zorzi brought in a figure like Plotinus, who did not associate beatitude directly with vision like Thomas Aquinas, or with love like Scotus, but with transformation and union with God through the force of intelligence and love. And then Zorzi said that there was no discrepancy here with Christ, who asked that all might be one in him, just as he and the Father were one. Again, a model of this sort of integration of scholastic, Jewish, and ancient Platonic materials was Pico. in a way that resonates with what we saw in Fisher. This becomes even more evident, and this is my final discussion here, in the case of the Franciscan Arcangelo da Borgonuovo, writing in the 1550s and 60s, who wrote an entire work articulating Pico's Kabbalistic theses, largely plagiarized from Zorzi. Pico had intended to defend, as one of his famous 900 theses, one of these Kabbalistic ones confirming the Christian religion, quote, what the Kabbalists say, that we will be beatified in the shining mirror, restored to the saints in the future world, is exactly the same following their principles as that which we say, that the saints will be beatified in the Son of the Father. The Franciscan Borgonuovo began his elaboration by pointing to Augustine's claim in the De Trinitate that man is formed for the sake of beatitude, and the famous line from the Confessions that man is restless until they rest in God. Like Zorzi, Borgonuovo contrasted Aquinas' view of beatitude as rooted in cognition or vision, Scotus's as rooted in fruition and love, and Plato's as transformation and union, drawing upon the Symposium and Plotinus. And then the Franciscan theologian added a link between the 10 Sephirot, or manifestations of God in the Kabbalah, and the denarius paid by the master of the vineyard, a parable read as being about beatitude. The multiplicity in the Kabbalistic account of God's manifestation did not perplex Borgonuovo. After all, Christ taught that in my Father's house are many mansions. In another one of Borgonuovo's Kabbalistic works, he engaged his Scotistic formation as well. He offered detailed analysis of Pico's work and Kabbalistic works such as the Zohar, with reference to the original Hebrew and ranged across the Platonic corpus. Nonetheless, in a discussion of the different views of the animation of the heavens, Borgonuovo wrote that Scotus was easily the prince of theologians, and then in the index says Maximus Theologorum. The greatest of theologians is Scotus. Franciscans involved in these pursuits in Platonic and Jewish materials could positively recall key elements of their Scotistic formation. What is perhaps even more remarkable is that mainstream professors of Scotus theology and philosophy praised these intellectual pursuits decades after their initial enthusiasm. Girolamo Polantieri, a Bolognese Franciscan theologian who would go on to teach theology at Padua, wrote an endorsement of Borgonuovo's work on Pico's Kabbalistic theses in 1564. He began by saying that while some human beings were content to resemble the brutes, others strained their natural capacities and could be reckoned with celestial beings. Polantieri saw Borgonuovo as one of those human beings who pursued a divine wisdom even more sublime and more secret than what theologians address everywhere. Polantieri described the Kabbalah as a form of knowledge passed down orally from God, Moses, or his successors. These teachings were cultivated by Borgonuovo as almost no one else of this age. Polantieri admired him not only for his penetration, but also for his strenuous labors, his sweating away at the task. And here in the 1560s, Polantieri could call Pico a miracle of nature. So despite the fact that some of Pico's and Reuchlin's interests in the Kabbalah were rejected by figures like Pico's nephew, John Francesco, by Erasmus himself, by the early reformers, and most harshly by the group of theologians who sought to destroy Jewish books in the Reuchlin affair of the early 16th century, and I found something like this in later Scotists like Filippo Fabri, this form of Christian Hebraism did not disappear. Even if the study of the Kabbalah was unconventional and at times aimed polemically at Jewish thinkers, there was a continuing desire to make use of the study of languages more widely available in the Renaissance and to renew theology by going ad fontes. A prominent Scotistic theologian after the Council of Trent, like Polantieri, could praise Pico as a wonder and show an interest in Kabbalistic materials. Indeed, Pico seems to have provided a model, not only for figures like Fisher, in Erasmus's circle, but also for mendicant friars trained in scholasticism to see the significance of these texts made available to Christians in the Renaissance. Humanist attention to Latin eloquence put Scotism on the defensive, but the idea that style must be accommodated to the subject matter, and that John Duns Scotus was dealing with the most profound and arcane mysteries was part of the explanation of his subtlety. At that point, some of the options available for Franciscans during the Renaissance were, on one hand, engaging in a task of illumination and pedagogical simplification, or on the other, exploring even more arcane subjects. Thank you.